there was so much emotion, I think, in fashion in the 90s. In a way, we've seen that emotion fade over time, that other considerations have become more important. But I think that the creativity of that decade stays with me as part of my own mythology in a way. Like, these shows live in my memory the way that a favorite book or a favorite movie or a favorite piece of music does, as just things that I have created a whole web of personal references around. So I'm really looking forward to talking about them, actually really looking forward to revisiting them, because I've never been able to do this forensically, and this is a nice opportunity. So this show is a Jean Paul Gaultier show for spring 1994. Gaultier staged this show in the Galerie Vivienne in Paris, which is one of the beautiful old 19th century shopping arcades that are sprinkled around the city. His store was actually in the Galerie Vivienne. The show was called La Tatouage because Gaultier had become fascinated with tattoos. He had been going to tattoo conventions, and he talked about seeing this incredibly beautiful older woman wearing a see-through blouse, and he was fascinated by her bra. And then he realized that she had pierced nipples, and he saw that her bra was actually tattooed on her body. And he became really absorbed by the culture of tattoo culture. Yeah, I would have to go to Gaultier's offices the morning of the show and beg, steal, or borrow. He had an incredibly formidable man on the front desk. I think he was from Vietnam. His name was Monsieur Henri. And you can talk to anybody who ever had dealings with Gaultier in the early 90s, and Monsieur Henri will feature somewhere in the story. He was like, you know, where the pharaohs had tomb dogs. He would sit there and just close down any further connection you were trying to have with anyone else in the house. It was no, 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 no. So I would just sit in the reception area until somebody came out that I could throw myself on the mercy of. And then outside Gaultier shows would be like, I mean, the modern equivalent would be something like a Virgil Abloh show. A huge mob of absolutely desperate people without tickets, screaming and wailing and attacking any barricade that was in front of them. In those days, busloads of, it was so amazing. It was just like, it really was another world. Busloads of drag queens and club kids would come in from Berlin, and the big shows were Westwood, when Westwood started showing in Paris, Martin Sitbon and Gaultier. And to get into any of those shows was such a coup. And even me with my, waving my standing room only, my standing ticket, your sense of accomplishment at breaching the barricades was so extreme. The music was drifting spiritual music, and the models were waving incense, and he managed to combine the spiritual and the carnal and some social commentary that ran through his shows. Always this embrace of the other. France being notoriously xenophobic about the other, and Gaultier's own particular culture brought in all different kinds of people. As you can see in the show, there were the supermodels of the moment, and there was also just this fabulous street casting of people that I guess would be called crusties now. The show, looking at it now, there's an audacity to it. There's a sort of casual eroticism. Then there was this incredible couture-like elegance that he could bring into streetwear. I mean, he is an incredible cutter of clothing. After a decade of shows like this, you're like, oh my God, another brilliant show from Jean Paul Gaultier. What's next? So this one is a wonderful opportunity to slam on the brakes and have a good look at what he achieved, I think. There's Christy Turlington right there. And there's Kirsten Owen right there, my favorite model of all time practically, Linda Evangelista and Kirsten Owen. There's bits of a suit of armor used here, like a Joan of Arc reference. I took it to be a Joan of Arc reference. And then there's incredible pinstripe suits. There's all pinstripe jackets, which are a Gaultier signature. There's a lot of sarongs. There's a lot of obvious Asian references, but incorporated in such a way that you could imagine if there was some kind of global calamity, which of course we're looking at right now. You try to imagine a world that people might create for themselves with whatever was left of when the tsunami of humanity recedes, what's left sort of flapping on the dry sands that are remaining, and putting them all together into a new story for a new age. I think that's what Gaultier managed to do quite often, and I think in this collection he does that brilliantly. I think freedom was something that Jean Paul Gaultier always talked about. He wanted to present a world that was unrestricted, you know, that where race and gender and faith weren't reasons to exclude people, that his outlook was incredibly inclusive. I think here's Nadia Aumann in one of those sort of 18th century styled vests, highlighting the fact that Gaultier was an incredible tailor as well. And his muse was this man Tennille walking here, who would wear anything in Gaultier's shows. He would end up in, you know, the most extravagant ball gown. I mean, look at a dress like that. There's a sort of, a couture silhouette. You could, Vivienne Westwood and Jean Paul Gaultier, Christian Lacroix. You think about how all at the same time these designers were using the sort of formality of fashion to make subversive comments about beauty and about, I think, the role of fashion. I'm just thinking now that the journey of the show from that very profligate kind of the beauty, the wild beauty of the tattoo clothing at the beginning, the sarongs and the jewelry and the ornate, I suppose tribalism is a word that's fallen out of favor, but I think it was really important to Gaultier that he made the way he had a close circle of friends around him who modeled in his shows, who personified his aesthetic, then to layer them with tattoos and graffiti and really emphasizing a sort of wild street culture, I suppose. It was a tribe that he made, that he created. And in this show, I think from the beginning to the end, there's a sort of, it was a journey, ending on this sort of purity, a ritualistic, see, I love ritual in fashion. I think fashion is fundamentally a ritual. I think the fundament of fashion is fetish. And that's about ritualized behavior and infusing objects with significance. There was a sense of a sort of spiritual transport. For me there was, which was probably helped by the fact that I have a feeling I might have been on some mind-altering substance during this show, which enhanced the splendor, the vividness of the colors, the fragrance of the event. His biggest influence was his grandmother. He managed to bring his grandmother into so much of what he did. Her knicker drawer was apparently a hugely interesting place for him when he was young, and the powder she wore and all these things and the corsets she wore. This is another thing I forgot to mention, that Gaultier's corseting was another signature. If a pinstripe jacket was a beautifully tailored pinstripe jacket was one signature, another was the corset. I think, and obviously his most famous corset was the one he designed for Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour. He was inspired by the things that lived on the margins of society. His first collections, I think he reused army surplus clothing, for example. You could say that he pioneered recycling, I suppose, or upcycling or circularity. I don't know. He was very devoted to bringing the lost and the forgotten, the overlooked into the spotlight. Cultures, ideas like vintage clothing, a reverence for the ingenuity that comes from restriction, you know, when you don't have much, what you do with what you've got. So morning of, I would have to go to the Gaultier office and practically sell my firstborn to get access to the show. Oh, there's Eugenie there, that's Eugenie. And she was a fabulous, she was so funny. She was like something from the 1920s, you know, like an eccentric Nancy Cunard type. There were times when I'm looking back at these shows, I look back at some old shows that have been mythologized furiously, like McQueen shows, and you forget how long they were compared to how long shows might run 8 minutes now, and these shows would run 45, 50 minutes. I'm very curious to see what history makes of this, events like this. We're now going to look at Alexander McQueen's show for spring 1998. The location of the show was the Gatliff Road Postal Depot, I think, in Victoria, this huge post-industrial, desolate space, cold and incredibly forbidding. And it became the venue for McQueen's shows for a while before he moved to Paris. The show was called Untitled. His original title for the show was Golden Showers. Obviously that struck the sponsor as a little bit outre, so I don't know if it was a fit of pique or not, but he decided it was going to be called Untitled, which is a real typical so there gesture. It's not necessarily the McQueen show that McQueen addicts would gravitate towards, but this show had the most enormous effect on me. I was really surprised that a fashion show could make me feel what this show made me feel. Where McQueen sat in fashion at this time, he was maybe 29 years old when he did the show, so he was a young man, but he was coming out of a string of very provocative, confrontational shows. I remember at the very beginning when I first started covering his shows for my TV program, and you couldn't film him so you could see his face because he insisted it was because he would lose his benefit if somebody saw the show and realized that he actually had a job when he was signing on. I think that might have been part of the myth. But also he wasn't even really producing clothes. I mean, he would show a collection, but they weren't designed to be sold and produced. They were really designed to create this image for him, create a sort of atmosphere around him, this, I guess, of mystery and transgression and provocation. And I think to this day, I've never really seen anything that was so simple, so stark, and so overwhelming. The show came in two halves. The models were walking on enormous, I guess it was lucite tanks that were filled with transparent, I guess, water, I suppose. I assumed it was water. So they were suspended on these glowing tanks. The actual ethos of the collection itself, as you can see, it's about tailoring. It's a fairly stark statement. The color palette was in the first half of the show very straightforward. The greatest fashion shows exist outside their context and thrive, take on additional weight with the passage of time. I think the McQueen's museum exhibition, Savage Beauty, really highlighted that. In a show like this, I think there are 100 looks in the show, at least 100 looks in this show, which is massive. It's a huge collection. And in Savage Beauty, when you saw maybe one look lifted out of the show and elevated, presented in such a way that it became, it became its own statement, you would lose sight of the fact that it was one look out of 100 from one show, and he did that over and over and over again. He was making an army in a way, like the hair and the makeup kind of created this kind of uniformity, a very forceful image of very strong women. This was Gisele Bündchen's, I think, one of her very first runway shows. I was backstage doing my hair and makeup interviews and trying to track down McQueen, who was very Greta Garbo about being filmed or interviewed backstage. And I saw this girl sitting on her own, and I didn't recognize her, but I thought she was extraordinarily beautiful. So I just went over and asked her who she was, because I always like to talk to models. I found they all had such interesting stories, how they got to where they were from, where they came from. And she told me that her agent in New York had said she was too curvy to book jobs in New York. And so he was going to send her to London, and she might get more work in London. Sean Lean's jewelry in this show is spectacular. He found a kind of heavy metal correlative for McQueen's own designs. You saw the male models with the metal jawbones. Creepy, like their jawbones had been shot away, and this was some kind of metal prosthesis. Sean Lean was fascinated with mouth jewelry too. You saw there's Gisele there. That is Gisele Bündchen, believe it or not. With mouth jewelry that sort of widened the mouth, restricted the movement of the lips. Beauty and horror, the twin poles, that's what I'm thinking of his design. He would make extraordinarily beautiful things, and then he would corrupt them in some way. I think even something like using that very acidic yellow was a kind of corruption. I mean, I actually think that man looks quite uncomfortable, and I think that McQueen would rather have enjoyed that sensation of discomfort. This first half of the show, or first 3/4 of the show, or first 2/3 maybe, the models walking on these tanks filled, glowing with this illuminated, transparent fluid. And this was, I guess, the collection. Then, at some point, when these models had left the stage, in this part of the story, everything stopped. Thunder and rain came on the soundtrack, incredibly ominous. I think it went dark. And the white tanks began to fill with black liquid that kind of flowed into the transparent liquid, like oil pouring into water or something. Oh, this is Sean Lean's pièce de résistance, a spine. It kind of reminded me of Alien, actually. And you see there's a real element of discomfort there. I think that's the beauty and horror element. Now you see that the tanks had filled with this dark fluid. It was incredibly creepy. That was and the music was Ann Peebles' I Can't Stand the Rain. And I think that there was also the Jaws soundtrack in there somewhere. So there was I Can't Stand the Rain with this ominous pulse. And then the models walked through a rainstorm. And this was one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in a fashion show. And this was a golden shower. It rained, I guess, piss on these models who were walking in white, all white clothes, which clung to them as they got more and more drenched, and the makeup streamed down their faces, mascara just running down their faces, and their hair soaking wet. I think that he was a genius at biting the hand that feeds. So this was such a, hey, American Express, here's your golden shower for your golden credit card. And this just went on and on and on, and until I was almost mad with the deranged beauty of it all. You look at this show now and you wonder, you know, what did people think who were in the audience? Now, remember that you went to a McQueen show expecting something extraordinary. He, at this stage, had already done shows like The Birds and The Highland Rape. He'd already pushed the envelope in the most extraordinary way, or already brought down the outrage of the Daily Mail on his head. But I think generally people now were really tuned into what McQueen was doing. And this was such an accomplished, masterful show that I remember praise for it. I remember people just being grateful that he was able to sustain this level of vision, that he wasn't, you know, that he was now the standard bearer for British fashion. I remember people being awestruck. I mean, one thing that you would go all the way down to Victoria and you were sitting in this, this rather oppressive environment, and the shows would start very, very late. And you would walk out into the outside world and you know, you were stunned. I was stunned. And I can't, you know, working in fashion has been an enormous privilege for me. The things I've seen, because I've never felt that I was of fashion. I've never felt like an insider, but the things I've got to see in my time have just been so remarkable, and I think I was just so grateful that this was one of the things I got to see. Look at Alexander McQueen. I mean, that's the guy who just made what we saw. That, to me, yeah, if I know there's lots of designers who reject the notion reject the label of artist, but Alexander McQueen was an artist, just by the sheer alchemy of what he achieved. He was definitely, for me, he was an artist. Like a filmmaker is an artist, or a playwright is an artist. They have celluloid and words, and he had fabric. I always come back to this Christian Dior haute couture show for spring 1998 by John Galliano as my favorite show, because I felt like this was a summit of what fashion was capable of, in terms of creativity, in terms of imagination, in terms of fashion's ability to take you to another world. Now, maybe there are people who would say that this was not a world they wanted to be taken to. It's a world of such extravagance and privilege. So this show was a celebration of Marchesa Casati's style. Giovanni Boldini painted a very famous picture of her, which was on the invitation, which was really the starting point, I suppose, for John when he worked on the show. Fashion will never ever re-enter this arena. I mean, there was such a triumph of vision realized completely in a way that is awe-inspiring. I mean, they didn't work on these shows for months and months and months. I mean, if you talk to John's collaborators, things came together extremely quickly. And I mean, I think that was also a result of John's design process. With access to Dior's archives, he would have access to techniques that he'd never been able to, I mean, things he'd never been able to realize before. Stephen Jones's hats there, he told me, I think if I understood him correctly, he said that they made hats for every single model in the show. Even if she wasn't going to wear the hat, just the sense that she had a hat to wear, and maybe she'd taken it off and left it somewhere. Think about these little London club kids: John Galliano, Stephen Jones, Stephen Robinson, Michael Howells was a big London club kid, making these things. I mean, I find that quite awe-inspiring. The sort of interplay with the audience, the interplay of the models, the theatricality, and the confident theatricality of this show is something that I would say I miss. It wasn't sustainable, of course. I've talked to people who really didn't like this show. They were extremely critical of it because I think they felt, like I just said, that they were if you were in the Comme des Garçons world, or if you were in the Helmut Lang world, or the Martin Margiela world, Margiela is often, it's interesting actually, Margiela is often brought up as a counterpart to this, counterpoint to this kind of show, as being the antidote, but also actually the necessary antidote, the necessary correction. I know that Galliano did maybe one more show that was extremely over the top like this, and then there was a sense of restraint that entered. For the millennium, his shows became, for him anyway, more restrained. But getting into this show would have started late. Again, the invitation would have been the hottest ticket. There would have been a mob scene. I'd wait for anything up to an hour afterwards to talk to him. But I just loved it. It was sort of strenuous, but it was so inspiring. And I was on the grand staircase of the Opera Garnier. The location was the Opera Garnier, the famous opera house where the Phantom of the Opera was living in the basement, probably while the show was going on. And it's the most incredible, ornate building. And what John and his team did with this show was turn the entire place, or everything that he had access to, into little vignettes. Each little space of the opera house had something else going on. I loved the room. There was Nijinsky, the Afternoon of a Faun, with that famous body makeup, but this model or this dancer lying on a, recreating the ballet, playing his little flute. And then another room, there was a gypsy band playing, and there was the Marchesa Casati herself with Russian wolfhounds. The whole ambience of the show was established the minute you walked in. Galliano's shows started late, so you had plenty of time to walk around and enjoy the whole mise en scène before you took your seat. And in this particular instance, I don't think there was ever a time when every single detail of the show, from the set to the hair, the makeup, the clothes, the jewelry, everything was just so utterly complete. It was, this show, there were 38 looks, 39 looks. It was over quite quickly. And you think of the amount of effort expended on these minutes, on these few minutes of just Hollywood or Broadway's, but more Broadway actually, Broadway's spectacular beauty. I remember I walked out of this show and said, if they put this on Broadway, they could sell tickets, because I heard that he never had money to pay anybody, so he used to pay the models and the clothes. And so a lot of those really extraordinary dresses he designed, I just love this footage of the finale. I mean, what you don't get in film is the sort of the rhythm of the show, the steadily escalating hysteria of the whole thing, that each outfit was more extravagant than the one before. And John Galliano was at a peak. I think this was a peak for him. There would be others. And, you know, it's as with McQueen, as with Gaultier, as with the great showman of the 90's, it's you know, it's tricky, it's difficult to pick a favorite one, but this show blew my mind, so I always come back to it.